I'm Alan Felton, pastor at Resurrection United Methodist Church across town, and again, we welcome all of you tonight, and it's my pleasure to be able to very briefly introduce our panel and then to moderate the discussion after their remarks. And we're all in for a treat tonight. I think we would be hard-pressed to find anywhere in the country a more esteemed and learned panel of scholars and public servants than that we have here in front of us. And so we appreciate everyone being here. Our community partners, those who are in charge of those who patrol our streets and keep us safe and serve this community so well are here, and we're very delighted to have them. Assistant Chiefs Edward Sarvis and Jesse Burwell. We're glad to have you gentlemen tonight and welcome you. Also from our Divinity School community, we have Reverend Dr. Willie Jennings, who will frame our conversation for the evening, and then all of the others will speak to specific aspects of this issue of Black Lives Matter. We'll have Reverend Dr. J. Kameron Carter, Reverend Dr. Mary McClintock Fulkerson, and Reverend Dr. Eboni Marshall Turman, who is the Assistant Research Professor of Black Church Studies and Director of Office of Black Church Studies at Duke. Dr. Fulkerson is Professor of Theology at the Duke Divinity School. Dr. Carter is Associate Professor of Systematic Theology and Black Church Studies at the Divinity School. And of course, Dr. Jennings, Associate Professor of Theology and Black Church Studies. So we welcome them all. We're going to turn it over to Dr. Jennings in just a moment, but welcome our panel with a round of applause, if you will.
We do want to invite our community partners and Assistant Chief Edward Sarvis, who is representing Chief Lopez this evening, who was not able to be with us because he's away at a training. But we want to welcome Assistant Chief Sarvis. If you would greet us, Chief, and welcome us.
I don't know how to work these things, so. Good evening. Thank you for inviting us to be a part of this conversation tonight. Like they said, Chief Jose Lopez is actually out of town in training. He's at a Chiefs of Police conference. I'm Ed Sarvis. I'm one of the assistant chiefs for the Durham Police Department. I actually am the assistant chief over our north side operation, so everything north of our freeway. With me is Assistant Chief Jesse Burwell over our administrative services. And we're one of 4 assistant chiefs in the department, so we are glad to be a part of this conversation. Now, I understand some of you are not from Durham, so you may not realize that we are actually headquartered directly across the street from this church. We hold all of our academy graduations and our promotion ceremonies and award ceremonies in this very room. So we are great neighbors, and we have loved being neighbors with Duke Memorial Church for quite a few years now. We are looking at moving on, so we may be moving into a new building before too long, but we're going to enjoy it as long as we can. We're an agency of about 650 employees. 513 or so are sworn police officers, and the other 125, 130 are non-sworn employees of ours, but very much a part of our department. And we are glad to take part of this conversation, glad to be neighbors with this church, and look forward to question and answer and enjoy it.
Good evening, everyone. I am Willie James Jennings. I teach theology at Duke and Black Church Studies. I am thrilled to be here this evening. I want to thank the ministerial team that put together this wonderful panel discussion. It is a great joy for me to share this panel with such esteemed colleagues and our colleagues in law enforcement, and of course, the brilliant Bishop Hope Morgan Ward. Very glad to be in her presence. There are many people, many of us know here that are close to us, close to our hearts, but I do want to just take a moment of panel privilege, if I may, and acknowledge one person here who is very dear to the Divinity School and to this community, the widow of the late Frederick Herzog. Kristen Herzog is here, and I want, if she could, just to raise her hand and be acknowledged. A great theologian in her own right. She is the widow of a gentleman. If he were alive today, he would be sitting here. And many of you who knew him know that to be the case. A man of incredible integrity and courage. Well, I'll be brief because I want to make sure that we have a conversation. And to have a conversation, we panelists will discipline ourselves. We are all ministers, so you know that's going to be difficult. Discipline ourselves to limit our comments, especially if it's something we all feel so passionately about. As I understand it, there are three realities that bring us here tonight. Realities that shape all of us in this room, including our colleagues in law enforcement and all of us who name the name of God in a variety of ways. The first is the violence that permeates us. We are shaped in violence in this country, and we should never run from the reality of violence that is in us. We have been taught that violence can solve problems, and many of us have been shaped inside the quick reflex of turning to violence in the midst of things that are difficult, complex, and ambiguous. Many of us have been taught that violence clarifies, violence makes things easy, violence solves problems. We live in a violent country. Let us never forget that this country produces more weapons than any other country on the planet. We are a violent people, born and shaped in violence. And we must face that in all that we say and do. Violence is a temptation we have yielded to again and again. The second reality that shapes us and brings us here is our racial consciousness. We have been taught to see dark bodies, black bodies, brown bodies as dangerous, as frightening, as suspicious. And we approach those bodies with that. We are taught this in every form of media in front of us, and it is in all of us. When I walk across the campus at Duke University, I must wear my bow tie and my jacket, because if I walk around in a sweatshirt, sweatpants, I am going to be looked at as though I am a problem, even though I am quite a handsome man. I will still be looked at as though I'm a problem. Racial consciousness is in us, and it has taught us how to look at each other. We have been shaped in a pedagogy of race. We look and think inside of it, and no amount of wishing will change that until we face how we are taught to look at each other that way. It is the teaching that must be dealt with. And so our sisters and brothers in law enforcement, like the rest of us, have been shaped in that pedagogy. The third reality that brings us here, that shapes us, is the sickness of our forgetfulness. As a country, we don't know what to do with our past. In fact, what we have been taught is to forget the past as quickly as possible. As someone said to me before we began this evening, if you watch the news right now, you would not think that the events of last month actually happened. You would think that deflated footballs are just as important as the events from the last 2 weeks. This is a part of our legacy. We are taught to forget. And speaking to the Christians present, we must aim our lives against this very habit of American life. We are ones who understand what it means to remember the past, both distant and recent. So our work needs to address these three realities. And so I hope with whatever we say tonight, whatever we say to each other, we'll do a couple of things. We will talk to each other as though we care about each other, really care about each other. And remember these realities in our comments and ask ourselves, is what we're saying going to address these realities? Because if we don't address these realities, then whatever we say will not be enough. And I guess I'm going to turn over to my brother, Dr. Carter.
Thank you, Dr. Jennings. In many ways, I'm quite nervous because I feel I should be in the audience taking this in, taking in this conversation. It's a very important conversation, and I'm very honored and privileged to be in front of you and to offer a couple of remarks that I hope are in the spirit of what my friend and colleague, Dr. Jennings, has said, are helpful. I've been asked to speak to the voices of a new generation. I don't know why I was asked to speak of a new generation, but I was asked to speak in some sense to represent the voices of a new generation and the way in which they have spoken loud, publicly, and has raised public consciousness in the light of the events recently regarding the shooting death of Michael Brown, the choking death of Eric Garner. But the litany is quite long, as many of you know. It now includes Tamir Rice. We could go back to Trayvon Martin, Rhanisha McBride, and on and on and on. I think we must think very carefully and deeply about what the young people in our society have offered us. And one way to think about it, and I just want to sort of maybe anchor the force of my comments around this point. There are many things I could say that I would like to offer up, and maybe they'll come up in Q&A and so forth, but I just want to just give us one thing to think about. I want to suggest that what the protests, often spearheaded by young people, by the underclass, what they offer us, particularly those of us, again, who are here as Christian, as various stripes of religious, coming from our synagogues, our mosques, what they offer us is the question of what community means. I think part of what's at stake in this moment of ours, and has been at stake for a long time, is the struggle around who we see ourselves as bound to. Who is our community of care and concern? And what's so powerful about, I think, what the protesters offer us is a reminder of what community ought to be about. What the protesters sort of put on the table before us is a tradition that made them possible. A tradition that made them possible. Many of those protesters emerged out of a legacy of church traditions, many of them bound up with Black church traditions, in which the imagination of community was wide, arms extended very wide. It was a church tradition that laid claim to everybody and could claim everybody. Everyone could claim it, and it could claim everybody. And because its arms were wide, because it was inherently ecumenical in a society that often thought in kind of narrow terms about what communal life was, it offered an alternative vision of who we see ourselves bound to. Those protesters, we might say, are a 21st century manifestation of that long tradition. That includes people like Martin Luther King, right? That includes many Rosa Parks, right? This is a long tradition. And what, therefore, those protesters put before us is the question of, what does religious community, what does church community even mean? Can church community bear witness to a form of life together, being bound up with one another, such that the stories that we've been inculcated in as stories of fear are now withered at the vine, and we bear witness to another form of being bound up with each other? That is, it can be a witness to our larger culture that there's another way to imagine our connections to each other. And we must also remember that that form of life that's not predicated upon needing an outside in order to stabilize those who are inside of our kin and kith, that form of life destabilizes society and can only get read as dangerous. Can only get read as dangerous. And one of the things, dangerous to the current order of things. And one of the things that because it's dangerous, one of the things that happens is that there's the threat to snuff it out. The things I would like us to sort of continue to think about and ponder is, can we imagine alternative forms of social life, alternative forms of sociality? And might not the protesters, lifting off from the occasion of these killings that saddens all of us, can we join them in thinking about alternative socialities? Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.